Okay, good morning again. We are going to make a start, slightly late, but we have a good chunk of time to continue the conversation we began this morning in more detail. I'm going to keep my introduction as brief as I can, although I would like to share a few reflections of my own of the last year. Having begun my working life in the humanitarian sector, I think I received my real education in the UK rape crisis sector. It's there that I learnt how to provide non-judgmental, non-directive, and non-discriminating support to and for survivors and victims of sexual violence. I never stopped questioning how well I was doing that, and that's always up for question and should be. And that's the education and the grounding I was given there. For me, that means we have always been, the means have always been as important as the ends. Because in violence prevention and striving for structural change and equality, there are no shortcuts. Having said that, there is definitely a way to make improvement. And that is what this next session is all about. We are really privileged to have three very experienced practitioners on the panel. And we hope that the session today will bring about a conversation about the practicalities, answering the common and sometimes difficult questions that we receive about making change in this area. And we really welcome and hope and aim to have as much time with you so you can ask us those questions once we've given our brief introductions and our 2 pennies worth. I think I'm going to stop there, actually, apart from to share one story, and that is in the last year, I have been asked probably this question more than any other, having been at the heart of the media attention that Oxfam have received since October. And that has been, do the rules we have not work, and do they need to change? And my most resolute response to that has always remained, the rules that we have are perfectly adequate. They were designed after careful thought and preparation when almost exactly the same thing, as has just happened in 2002. And under Kofi Annan's direction, we birthed the UN Secretary General's Bulletin on PSEA. For me, the rules aren't the wrong rules. They're just not well enough understood by our leadership, and they have not been enforced. So that's how I would like to start the session today. Most of what you'll be hearing from us, I suspect, is probably not new or particularly groundbreaking, but it is a brilliant opportunity for what we hope will be an open conversation. And the same rules will apply to this session as did for the morning. So we hope, in order to encourage an open participation, we'd like to hear a respectful and sensitive tone, and also to warn you that whether we're directly talking about abuse or not, these can be extremely triggering experiences. So please feel free to remove yourself from the room, but also come and chat to us after if you've been quite affected by anything that's been said. Okay, we're going to make a start, and I'll come and sit down. All right, without further ado, I am going to introduce you to our panel members. Julian, you have been you have described yourself to me as someone who's all about ethics. He comes from multiple sectors and described to me this morning that he only has a toe in the humanitarian sector. I think he's being a little bit hard on himself, but I will pass over now to hear what he thinks about ethics and what he thinks are some of the solutions to the issues that we're discussing today.
Great, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. I have to say up front that it's also slightly nerve-wracking being a representative of dead white European malehood to come up here and pontificate on some of these issues, many of which, because of my position and status, I haven't really been exposed to. But I want to start, one of the reasons why I was interested in this whole conference was because I'm very interested in concepts of dignity. And it seems to me, if that is the kind of moral focus of this session, it seems to me that there is something in the concept of dignity that can really provide us with some assistance when we are approaching some of these furiously complex and emotionally and politically charged issues. And when I was listening to Sheather this morning, she was talking about the kinds of emotions that this kind of debate generates. And one of the emotions that I felt was sadness in some ways. It's this sector, this humanitarian sector, so intensely focused on bringing goods to the world, slides away, is in some respects corrupted by behaviour that does not reflect its fundamental and core values. But after feeling sadness, I then was thinking, but it's quite extraordinary, this conference, because one of the wonderful things about this sector is it's willing to talk openly, frankly, in such an engaged way with some of these issues. So I felt a kind of surge of optimism. And it struck me that if I think about the kind of underlying, the fundamental principles of humanitarian engagement, if I look at this concept of dignity, it seems to me that it points towards a number of principles that need to underpin the way in which the sector goes about its business, both internally facing and also externally facing. Now, my interest, I'll be quite candid, my interest in this has grown up from some of the work that I've done with and alongside Médecins Sans Frontières. And one of the interesting things about looking at an organisation that is working in this sector is that it seems entirely appropriate that those working for an organisation can make certain very fundamental rights claims against its employer, and the employer is quite simply and straightforwardly the duty bearer. The employer has duties towards its employees, and its employees have rights claims against the employer. So we're in a situation where we can actually change things. Organisations have the agency to change that. And listening to the stories, listening to the testimonies this morning, and thinking about concepts of dignity, it seems to me quite straightforward that drawing on the core humanitarian principles, organisations should simply say, we have a duty to ensure that our employees feel safe. And it seems to me that therefore organisations have a kind of clear steer coming from their fundamental values to say, okay, this is the kind of workplace we need to strive to. Yes, we're talking about human beings. Yes, we're talking about profoundly, if you're anything like me, profoundly fallible creatures. We're never going to get perfection, but we can create a system, we can work to create a system within which people feel safe and organisations recognise that they have an obligation to bring that about. If organisations don't do that, they are, it seems to me, morally incoherent. To attempt to bring about the great goods in the world that the humanitarian sector strives to bring about without also exercising those values and virtues within their organisation, you have incoherent organisations that are set up to fail, it seems to me. So we have that. I think we have a clear sense of progress, a clear direction. That seems to me to be the easy bit. Talk about rights is the easy bit. That's getting organisations to recognise their responsibilities and to fulfil them. That's the easy bit. What becomes more complex, and where we have to have the challenging, the difficult conversations, is to recognise that within that broad rights framework, there is enormous scope, particularly in humanitarian aid, where we're talking about people from so many different cultures, so many different backgrounds. There is enormous scope, both for learning from each other, but also for confusion and massively putting our feet in the wrong places. So what we need to do, establish the right structure, and then go in and have the challenging conversations about what in this climate, at this time of cultural change, what it actually means to be respectful of those rights within that context. And that is the next big, interesting question, and that, it seems to me, is where we are. I agree entirely. The laws that are in there, many of the laws and many of the underlying principles are established. One of the things we're struggling with is saying, what does that mean in the here and now, engaged with this cultural change as we are now? And that's a huge challenge. But there's also one third step, and then I'm going to pass the microphone on. There's one third challenge. We were listening this morning about testimony, about the accounts of survivors, about people feeling that they haven't been heard, that they haven't been listened to. And if we're serious about dignity, one of the attributes, as we heard yesterday, one of the attributes is feeling physically safe. But another attribute of human dignity is having the agency to create our own stories and have our stories respected. So it's easy to see how a failure to listen to people, a failure to respect people's stories, fundamentally undermines human dignity. Not having your story heard and believed is a huge challenge to dignity. But as an ethicist, someone used to working in areas where principles conflict, where goods are in tension with each other, we also have to recognise the vital moral and practical importance of due and fair process. If we're talking about justice, there are times when we have to lean enormously heavily in areas of conflict and uncertainty on due process. And one of the big challenges is getting that process right. Sometimes it seems to me, where you're talking about individual wrongdoing, it's entirely appropriate for that to be an internal process. But if we're talking about claims, deep structural claims about organisations, their malfeasance, their malfunctioning, it really may be the case that there it's appropriate to look externally. When we're talking about due process, we are talking about complex procedural issues that we have to try and get right. So that's really what I want to say. I feel optimistic in the sense that the principles that drive the need to respect all human dignity are alive and well within the humanitarian sector, but there are clear problems and clear challenges with their application. We don't need to reinvent the principles. We need to understand how they work in this time of cultural change, in this time of cultural challenge, how they work and what a good exercise of those principles looks like in this context. And we also need to invest energy into due and transparent process, because then people will trust the system. And in the absence of trust in the system, people will not come forward. And what will emerge in one form or another is explosive scandal, not respect for due process and listening to people's narratives. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julian. If I may ask a quick follow-up question before we move on to Ghida. So we heard yesterday in the UK from the chair of the NGO regulator, the Charity Commission, a call to action for all NGOs working in the UK, very much in the context of the current situation. And if I can quote her accurately, she asked us to avoid extravagance, complacency, and the appearance of self-interest, which I think is incredibly provocative and is the kind of tone that practitioners like me have been pleased to see. If I may draw on a conversation we had yesterday in preparation for today, over a cup of tea, I was really interested in some of the work that you have got coming up in the sector, which involves looking, I think, at something very, very critical and very important, but up until now very controversial, and that is the difference in treatment from remuneration, but also in terms of respect and experience of risk between how we somewhat offensively term our national staff and our international staff. Are you able to expand anything on what's inspired you to take that particular direction?
I mean, it seemed to me that that was the theme of yesterday morning's session. And if there is a kind of sub-theme that's moving through the whole of this conference, it's about power. It is about power within the sector. It's about the concentration of power. It's about a potential abuse or misuse of power. And it's also about redistribution of power and agency. And one of the things it's absolutely vital to do, and I know this work is going on in a lot of places, is to map those issues within the sector. And that's part of the process that I'm involved. We need to gather data. We need to understand how it works within the sector before we can make, I think, informed and necessary change.
Thank you very much. And I will hand over to our next panelist, Ghida Anani, who is joining us here today from Lebanon. And she's the executive director and founder of Abad, which I believe you set up in 2011, from memory. I'm going to hand over to you, but we're really keen to hear about this grassroots, bottom-up, gender-based violence work that you're doing there.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, I have to start by also looking at this entire question nowadays about PSEA and how this acronym became very famous in a couple of months only just because these stories came out to the media. And I'm a little bit like always like questioning why we're making this entire fuss about it, though sexual abuse is something that was accompanying women and girls, especially in time of conflict for decades now. So it's important at the beginning to flag that the issue of abuse and violence and sexual abuse specifically is not something new. And the PSEA as a policy or else is it's not the magical solution that can address the problem. Just because a piece of paper, as Dr. Julian was highlighting as well, it's not about that. It's about the entire practicality. It's about how we're integrating mitigation and response within our own organization. What does that mean? It means as leadership and as management to acknowledge the fact that by applying integrating all these principles, actually it is the benefit and the win-win for an organization, rather than being lazy about, like, I don't want to produce this document or apply it because of the arguments and pretexts always that it requires time, it requires resources, we don't have money to hire people only to do investigation. We're a local NGO. We don't have definitely an annual budget similar to any UN agency, though we're applying it since the start in 2011, even before the Me Too campaign and other campaigns and the survivors that actually came out in a very brave way to claim about these things. And this, at least I can say, the minimal benefit was for the organization. We have a very minimal turnover yearly of our staff. And I think recruitment and induction and all of these for management is way costly in sense of time and resources, rather than ensuring a safe environment that respects not only the dignity but the integrity of all team members and the well-being in such a context that we're all striving in. I always ask the question, even to our partners from UN agencies and NGOs, like really how serious you are in applying the human resources recruitment process. Because from me, this is where we start from the beginning to prevent sexual abuse from happening inside organizations and from any of the members toward any of the right holders or beneficiaries. And this is a very serious step for us as Abad, as organization, in sense of like really selecting, in the selection of who to be part of the organization, in the sense of like level of interview we do, the face-to-face where we embedded in the questionnaires, like questions looking at psychological aspects, not psychological tests, but some questions that we believe can also give us indication of how much the person believes in non-violence and abuse. At the same time, there's a written exam that is done. The reference check, we don't simply send the form. We want to ensure that it's filled out by direct line management with a proof evidence, because we know that sometimes I can simply list a name of an ex-colleague in an organization and say that this is the person as line manager to provide the reference, and at the end of the day, and actually it happened once, we discovered that as organization, that the person was actually leaving this international NGO because of accusation of corruption and abuse of power, and she gave us name of 2 people in the organization as being the line manager. But making sure as human resource department that in the reference check we make sure of this. We're very serious about the 3 months probation, where we look at like really not only performance, but we do 360-degree evaluation inclusively to people they deal with, before saying, yes, you passed this period of time and now you're fixed term in the organization. And also the angle of like really committing to do the performance review, again 360-degree, in making sure that we're inclusive to peer, colleagues, supervisors, beneficiaries, and all of this regularly. This regularity is very important to mitigate abuse within organizations and toward the beneficiaries. As organization, like really working on gender-based violence, for us it's a red line. We cannot be managing safe shelters for women survivors of gender-based violence, forced prostitution, forced trafficking, forced marriage, survivor of rape, while having among the team people abusing their power to actually replicate that within the organization. Same for safe spaces, same for our men centers and our mobile unit. We talked about it yesterday. I'm not going to elaborate here a lot. But at the same time, mainstreaming the PSEA and the complaint mechanism and the information about it across, it goes simply with the meal package, the monitoring and evaluation and learning package, that at every single session, we introduce briefly, like you have the right to talk about anything that will make you feel uncomfortable, to leave the session, and making the complaint box and different levels of reporting like really known by the people we're serving, and same within the organization. And trust me, this is not costly. It's simply when you do it as part of the routine, not foreseen as a standing alone measure, it will be much more easier for everybody to trust the system and to trust to come in. But at the same time, making sure that this is accessible like in the planning for everybody, not only for women coming to centers, but like making those that are illiterate feel comfortable in coming in. How? We ask them, what is the best modality you feel comfortable about it? We did like focus a group on every single medium of reporting to take into account diversity and to take into account, like yesterday we were talking about the inclusion. Like for people with special needs, elderlies, illiterate, women head of household, that they don't have their own phone number, for mobile number, for instance. How do they feel comfortable to talk about if there's any violation from anybody from the team? At the same time, to know that if they do that, what will happen? And here I will conclude by one important note for us, joining the ethical consideration about it. It's how we ensure if someone discloses this is not gonna come like backfire in a sense that will cause more vulnerability to the person. So we know that women that come and report, even a staff member or women we're serving, in context like Lebanon, and I think this is across, making sure that accompanying the woman in her reporting, acknowledging her pain, acknowledging her suffer, at the same time, walking the walk in the procedure while ensuring that she's not gonna be additionally abused by her community, by her husband, by religious leaders, and considering that if she's talking about sexual abuse, it means she cannot go back, and she dishonored the community and dishonored I don't know what. So making sure that the process is done with high ethical consideration in protecting, like the respect of human protection principles, is very key and very vital. And this need to be communicated while presenting PSEA and the complaint mechanism. To say, like, ensuring confidentiality, ensuring the respect of the choice of the survivor in whatever she wants to do, the commitment and being brave to go to till the end, whatever the cost will be, to stand by the staff member or the woman, is very essential to build the trust and the credibility around the system, and will make it more functional in sense of people coming in and feeling comfortable to talk about these matters. Inclusive to men, because also for us, the men, we had a couple of reporting toward one of the psychologists with whom we collaborated. Though it was a negative transfer in sense of toward the therapist, it was a man from LGBT community, and like not getting into the game much. He felt like there were like flirting in the sessions with the psychologist. Even with that, and he reported like complaining about the attitude and of the psychologist and so on, not getting into so much details about the story itself, but even with that, we made sure to investigate, we made sure to come back with feedback to the men that was coming to the men clinic, and making sure also to give him the opportunity, if he wants also, to make other men knowing, without names, about the process, because this will encourage others to speak about things that they feel uncomfortable about in the service. And even with that process, this has strengthened the system of the Men Center in sense of having more men coming without feeling accusated, labeled, ashamed to talk about the abuse they were living in their life, or issues of masculinities, but at the same time feeling that this is not going to be exploited. And we will stand by them no matter what. So I want to conclude here and then open to any question you have about practical aspects. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ghida. That's really, really extremely informative and also inspiring. Before we move on to the questions in the room and Marion's contribution, I wonder if I might ask you a question to develop further some of the things that you've just introduced to us. It strikes me now more than ever that the task we have at hand in our sector, in whichever part of our sector we represent here, that we have to invest in a big clean-up act. We have to invest in a process of getting our own house in order. And I think all of the panelists have discussed prior to this session the need to live by example. And actually, one of the things that strikes me about how passionately and how well informed we've heard about your process in your own organisation of working on these issues is that actually the same lessons could apply to people who are doing any kind of programming and could contribute quite significantly to improving the credibility that we all have in being given the privilege to serve the communities we serve. Can you say anything about how you think doing things the way that you have has improved your relationship but also with the community, but also your ability to do quality programming?
Thank you. It's actually at the core of like how Abad was able to achieve what we were able to achieve in only 7 years. Because investing in the people in sense of having them more and more familiar with the culture of the organization, with the values of the organization, building their capacities, investing in them is very key. And retaining the team, or at least retaining the memory of the work and building up is very important in the relationship with partners and in the relationship with beneficiaries, because not every day you will have a new face introduced as being the protection manager or the case manager. This is definitely very harmful. My background originally is clinical counselor, and I know very well. I have been doing for 8 years counseling for women affected by GBV and men, and I know how harmful it can be when you do the handover to a new person as if the human is a file. People are not file. They're like simply a compilation of emotions and value, and building the trust with the person is very important. And I always wonder, like, why we don't ask the same question for ourselves. Like, would you feel comfortable to go over and over and retell your story to someone completely new, even if they know about it, as if it's about only information sharing? It's about a rapport. So to help the person like really reflecting about their lives. So for us, the benefit, the huge benefit was the ability in this integrity and an integrative like system, even if some people decided to move for any life planning, and of course it happens, but at least you don't have bad relationship and bad memory around and the reputation around the organization, in sense of while the people, if they decided to leave, not because something wrong happened, because of the rumors sometimes can kill organizations. And this helped us in building very strong relationship with our partners, international partners, the government of Lebanon. Now we have like really well-established contracts and memorandums of understanding with the Ministry of Social Affairs, the Ministry of Public Health, the Ministry of Justice, and having ability to do that as local NGO in 5 years is not easy, just because they saw that the model of operation is really not only it's practicing what you preach. As activists, we cannot go on the street and ask for abolishing articles from the law about sexual abuse or lifting reservation on CEDAW Convention, while we know that we don't apply it internally, and we don't apply maternity leave aligned with these international conventions. And I think we're the only organization in Lebanon, even in the MENA, that we have a paternity leave. If we promote gender equality, you cannot, like, we talk about fatherhood, parenting, and we only give male staff 1 day. So that's why we go along with the international standards that we're preaching about. First, it's not easy, I have to say, of course, this kind of, like, when it comes to labor law versus, like, maintaining this system. But honestly speaking, as a founder and manager of the organization, I can definitely say that the benefits are way much more than not doing it, just because we believe that it will require lots of time and resources. No, the benefits are much, much, much way beyond. Thank you.
Thank you. I love those examples. And And as a theme clearly emerging this morning, being uncomfortable means we're probably doing something right. Drawing a bit on your really important point, I think there, Ghida, about not treating people as files. I think in the context of dignity, and many of the conversations I've heard here in the last couple of days, we've recognized that we systematically fail as a sector who is here to try and humanize people and the plight of people, to treat them as people, whether that's internally or externally. And one of the things I've often encountered in my role as an advocate, or indeed to enforce internal policies and due process, as Julian has described, and you yourself, is I've been accused of being overly emotional about an issue. And it's remarkable, because I'm trained in my sector before anything else to be reasonably objective and to understand the dynamics and to practice active listening. And what I realized over time, which I think helped us in the progress we saw within Oxfam, was that actually I was just processing the projection of the people I was talking to. And quite often, I don't know if you agree, but what you're really dealing with is fear. Fear of failure, fear of doing the wrong thing. And often when we really got to the bottom of a conversation with a manager who had just accused me of being overly emotional for trying to recognize the emotional impact of sexual violence on a human being, oftentimes you were dealing with a personal experience of their own. Or you were dealing with a sense that they would let somebody down, or indeed for some managers, this notion that you must always have an answer. And yeah, I don't know whether you've. For me, it's also been a real life experience in much of my work of blatant sexism, actually. And I wonder if you've experienced anything similar in trying to sort of add a human face to a problem.
Yeah, sometimes an answer can be simply saying, I don't have an answer. As simple as that. Just people, like, they prefer to hear that you don't know what to do about it, rather than avoiding. And that's what most of the organization, I think, and this fear comes from not knowing what to do, because not all organizations by necessity deal with sexual abuse or gender-based violence. And I know that from our various partners, and I say, as we don't know how to do maybe WASH, it's like normal that we fear something we don't know about, but at the same time, it's very important from a human perspective to say, I don't know, and refer to someone or to an entity that would be able to manage the demand. Because sometimes the most of the people will only say they just need a space, a safe space, to just share what they have to say, and they don't have a specific request. In the claims and that we receive few of the complaints, they're not asking even to have the person lose their job. So they're not asking in sense of measure, I want to see this person in jail, but it was simply saying, I want to share what happened and I feel very bad about it. And just acknowledging that feeling is more than enough to sufficient. Hence accountability. I would just add to the aspect of dignity, accountability. Accountability is at the core. If you just show that you're accountable toward the system, your system, that you put yourself, and you're accountable toward any violation of the system, it creates a safe feeling more than anything else. And definitely in the practice, as per your question specifically, we receive lots of like, sometimes kind of accusations in sense of, you're very tough about it. It's, come on, she might be like really creating that story, or he's like really, maybe he had a crash on the psychologist, that's why. And this is not only normal, but this is accompanying actually the sphere of gender-based violence. It's always about blaming the victim. So we know that as a culture. And that's why we need to be more firm about it, and respecting and acknowledging the story of the person, not putting in like the hypothesis as like she's lying or he's lying. And we know that. That's why you will receive that. You're very emotional about it. Why you're very feminist and radical about the way you're dealing with it. Okay, I'm a feminist. Yeah, this is not an accusation. I don't know what would that be. Don't need to justify it. Okay, and definitely we stand for women human rights, and we stand for human rights. We stand for men human rights as well, because for us the fight is against abuse and abuse of power, not against who is committing it. So either the man or the woman. And that's why in our complaint mechanism, by the way, I forgot to mention that, there's a way to report anything against me, even as a founder. Okay, a modality where anyone, if they feel like I abused any of my power, though the organization is an organization I personally established with a colleague of mine, she's a lawyer, to always be brave and putting all the levels of channels, safe channels, to report anything at any time and to be processed, because also this is important, not only reporting, but to show that you actually did something about it, while I'm totally out of the equation in the investigation or anything else, and make this known for everybody.
So we wrote a similar clause into our policies in Oxfam about me, and it's always sobering to see your name in print in that way. But absolutely necessary to demonstrate we've even thought about this as an issue, which I think certainly lends to that credibility and trust-building process. Before we move on to Marion, who will talk about a much bigger organisation, it's fair to say, and how the challenges we meet in addressing some of the issues that we're talking about today in an organisation like Oxfam, particularly in the context of what's happened in the last year. I think, Ghida, you made a point for me as a practitioner that I find myself repeatedly making, and that is I feel we've had far too much of a dialogue about how to train people to recognise who survivors are. We should know who they are. We do know who they are. They are us. They are you. They are the people we serve. We aren't spending enough time telling people and teaching them to have confidence that they understand what a perpetrator looks like, and actually giving them the confidence to call them out and to say, I don't care how good our friendship or our relationship was before now. I don't care how well you do your job as an engineer, as a whatever, as a PSEA practitioner. What's right is right and what's wrong is wrong. Full stop. Absolutely. And moving on finally to Marion, who's waited patiently to share her story about what I think is fair to say has been an enormously reflective period. Speaking from my own experience of Oxfam, until March this year, Marion Lisa is here with us today as Executive Director of Oxfam Germany, one of, I think, 20 Oxfams around the world who forms a confederation, and is kindly here to talk to us in particular about some of the challenges about applying the lessons and practices Ghida has brought to us today. At a larger scale, and in the context of having a very deeply personal and challenging stories about our organisation shared very publicly. So over to you, Marion.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you also to Sheather for a very, very touching and powerful keynote, in which she already addressed a few of the facets of the whole safeguarding issue we are talking about, and she's hinting also already on processes. Some of the examples she gave or others gave might have happened also in the organization I'm working for, and that is very appalling and especially makes me sad and angry as a woman, but also as a woman in a leadership function. Therefore, I'm very happy that at Oxfam we are having this reflective times and that we are moving on. And before I go into details on that, I would just like to put out where we are generally standing, because Oxfam is an organization which is rejecting discrimination and fights for justice. For sexual exploitation, abuse, or harassment of others, there is absolutely no room, and it's a gross violation of our purpose. And we are absolutely committed to a zero tolerance regarding any form of harassment, exploitation, or abuse, and do everything to prevent this from happening, and that's where the processes, procedures, protocols are coming in, where we will talk about more. Where it happens, we do vehemently and rigorously open cases, address it, and cooperate with governments, with authorities, and at the same time, we do have to have in mind that we have always a protective approach. Protection of survivors is key, but also people who are accused before everything is verified need our protection. To achieve that, we came up with a two-pronged approach, and this two-pronged approach is on one side looking into the standards, the protocols, everything you can name as a policy That is the one side, which is more formal. And then the other side is much more difficult, and we talked about that earlier, is the informal side, and that is a change within the culture, within the work culture, but the work culture is just a reflection of our society. So it is a very, very difficult task to really, really go to the bottom of the problem and address power abuse. Power abuse mainly happens between men and women, which is reflected in the imbalance of power in our society. Looking into leadership positions, looking into the distribution of work and responsibilities, we can see a vast imbalance between men and women, which is reflected in the power imbalance. To address all that and to go into a deep, deep reflection, Oxfam began to work through a 10-point plan. And this 10-point plan is consisting on one side in looking into past procedures, past cases of any kind of harassment, abuse, or exploitation, open cases again, and looking into the way they were handled. Have they been handled correctly? Was there anything missed? Do we need to address it again? So this is one side we are looking into. We are also openly asking people to come forward and explain to us what happened if they were not able to do so at the time things happened. Because we can see that there is more openness, there is more possibility for coming forward now. Oxfam, for example, has in 5 languages hotlines established, and people can come forward in whatever language they would like to talk to us. This is just one part of a larger plan, and you said earlier also that it's forever lacking resources, and Oxfam has committed €2 million just for the implementation of the 10-point plan. The 10-point plan is headed by an independent commission of high-ranking and very experienced experts when it comes to women's rights. So we have a lot of trust as an organization that they're steering, gearing, and leading us into the right direction. At the same time, as I mentioned earlier, the formal side has not to be underestimated because it goes hand in hand with the cultural change. If we are looking into, and it was mentioned before also, the recruitment processes we have, what can we do better? How can we do it better? When we look into how we are welcoming new workforce, what is the introduction looking like? What trainings are there, mandatory trainings now, for people to get aware also on tiny little signs of incorrect behavior, and really implementing the zero tolerance we are all striving for. And this is larger than just a piece of paper. It is also larger than the organizational frame or framing, because it has to do with a society which cannot accept any longer behavior which leads to harassment, which leads to abuse, and which puts women again at stake. So therefore, I'm also happy that Oxfam is not the only organization which is having that agenda now on the forefront of whatever we are doing and however we are implementing programs. And I can see that there is a vast interest of the whole community to push these topics in the right direction. Having said that, there are obstacles, and there are obstacles which are not only the culture, but there are also obstacles where we are having to be very reflective. Where do we want to go? Where do we where are we able to move towards, also when we look into protecting the rights of people, looking into data protection issues, and looking into personal rights of everybody. So I think it is quite an interesting process we are still in. We are listening a lot. Listening is key for the whole process. And we are also having people who are traveling and listening on the ground to cases which have happened in the various countries. So I have not only hope, but I'm convinced that this is the right approach. I'm convinced that at the end of all the things I have just in very few words been able to explain to you, we will have a safer organization, and we will have not only a changed organization, but we have been one of many other organizations changing our society to a better. Thank you.
Thank you, Marion. And I should have started by properly introducing you as somebody who yourself has worked always really for the promotion of civil society, but also particularly women's rights in the field, largely, from what I've understood. And so you have an experience of working in various different sizes of organisation. One of the things that Sheather raised in her keynote this morning as a challenge to large organisations in particular has been the need to listen better to the people in the organisation who already had those solutions. You've talked in the context of Oxfam's 10-point plan about external expertise, but I wondered if you could share with us how Oxfam has been through the process of re-evaluating its relationship to the people who were already doing this work inside.
Yeah, Oxfam has begun a process of talking, of constant listening and getting all the information it can from the ground to really get it embedded in the approach forward. And I think this constant process within each and every of the 20 affiliates, the conversations we have, not only in seminars or workshops, which look very artificial at times, but on lunches, on breakfast meetings, in a way which has not been there before. Less official, less formal, and less confrontative. And on top, we are just really wanting to hear where they are standing and where they feel we did wrong. Because we have to adjust in a way I think no other organization ever had experienced the need for adjustment.
Thank you. And you talked about a significant investment, increase in your investment in the work that you were doing here. For many organizations and representatives of organizations here, just as with any INGO or NGO, their resources are not infinite. So for me, I'm keen to hear from Oxfam's experience, and hopefully it will benefit those in the room, where you think the money is better invested in. You've got 10 points that you're focusing on within Oxfam, and Ghida's talked about some of the processes she went through internally in hers. Where, from your conversations and where you are now as an organisation, do you think the money is best invested? It's an age-old question, because there are many ways that you can do this.
No, I mean, Oxfam is reallocating funds, but since we are having the needs of women at the heart and core of a lot of things, and most things we are doing anyway, it is also looking into adjusting the programmatic approach and embedding the issues directly. And when we are talking about the human resources and recruitment approaches, for example, just to get a proper line in there that people from the beginning onwards are aware of what we are doing and how we are doing it. And it is more than just having a code of conduct which everybody is signing. And the code of conduct lays out behaviors very, very clear. But at the same time, it is just more than a piece of paper. And this is what we are able to do. I'm very convinced that we will have the conversations we need to have. And for always after 6 months or 12 months, again, going into the topics again and reminding people. So very often it is also reminding people of the way things should be done, things have to be done. And it has to do with a lot of discipline on our behalf. So money is one thing, but at the end of the day, as soon as the wagon is on track, I don't think it is an outrageous amount which is needed to keep it running.
Great, and it's great to hear that embedding this in programming, which is and should be the heart of what we're doing as a community, is very much on that agenda. I think that's really important. Okay, thank you. The lights have gone up, so we can actually see you this time. We have just over 20 minutes, and we would like to use this time for you, the audience, and our viewers online to ask questions of anybody on the panel, and we particularly encourage practical questions and comments to take this forward. I think we already have, I can see somebody in the back there, but do stick your hand up and we'll take a few at a time, I think.
Hi, Richard from Noha Chronican. One of the things that I know, thank you all for your talk. Two of the things that I thought were really good about was placing yourselves into the paradigm for potential for allegations and complaints and things like that. But one of the things that I think is missing from the conversation is men and boys as victims. The Women's Refugee Commission recently did a report in Mean Streets about men and boys as victims of SGBV. Harvard did some research in Athens on boys that were engaging in transactional and survival sex. And as much as it has taken so much effort for women to come forward in the Me Too movement, and you know, then there's the Kavanagh a trial that just makes a mockery of the power that women have got. I equally think that actually, because of the flip in power dynamics for men, particularly in beneficiary communities, coming forward is actually that much harder in some respects because of the lack of reporting capacity and the shame and the flip of those power dynamics. How can we engage with communities where there aren't proper terminology in some cases for men who have sex with men? And then, you know, with local workforces, how can we also enable people men who are victims as employees? How can we empower them to come forward as well?
That's an absolutely brilliant question, and I'm really glad somebody's asked it. So, before we tackle that, has anybody else got a question they would like to add? Was there somebody at the front here? Yeah. May we have we've got two here. Maybe double-pronged attack with microphones. We'll start here if that's okay, and then I'll come to you.
Yeah, hi, Carlina. I work with MSF. I've been around in the aid industry, as I used to call it, for 15 years, and I've seen drivers asking for services by telling people that they were having an influence if people got food, yes or no. I've seen senior managers using money, because that's the power they have as well, to have girlfriends which are indefined. Are they prostitutes? Are they girlfriends? These borders are extremely small. What I often miss a bit in the discussion, and while there is a lot we need to change in all these big organizations, also in MSF and the small organizations, because it's on all levels, it's local NGOs, national NGOs, international NGOs, UN system. Yeah. It's at what I loved about Shaista's speech, it's about power at the end. We're at this moment focused, rightfully, because it's a rightfully priority, about a lot about the internal reporting systems. Where I miss the focus, it's every time we put a lot on the plate when we discuss this, sexual exploitation, abuse of power, but it seems to always go a lot about how to address the complaints, but how do we make sure that people who are not working for us can make those complaints? The women of Haiti were mentioned a little bit in the beginning, but then they don't seem to appear anymore in our discussions. And how do we, and I think that needs to happen on a massive scale. I don't think even, I mean, yes, each organization needs to take its responsibility, but there needs to change something massively to make sure that the people in the Bangladesh refugee camps, that the migrants who are mixed in populations have access to a system where they can bring this forward. And I don't hear that drive. So I was just very curious to hear how you look at that.
Another fantastic question. Yeah, Me Too hasn't done a huge amount for the male survivor community or our beneficiary community at all. It's clearly the beginning of a process. One would hope. Thank you. We'll come back to this question. And we have another one here.
Hi, I'm Tom. I was just wondering if you think that there is a fundamental conflict between some elements of, say, people's employment rights and attempts to tackle this type of issue. Say somebody's accused of something, but then leaves before an investigation is sort of found against them. What powers would organisations have to tell other organisations about that person if they hadn't been kind of found guilty through a due process?
Excellent question. Okay, can we start with the first question? Does anybody on the panel particularly want to comment on in regards to this? Okay, thanks, Ghida.
I just want to thank our colleague for mentioning the male survivor, which actually I highlighted that maybe in a very indirect way in my presentation. In sense, for us, again, when we talk about gender-based violence, it doesn't mean violence against women. So that meaning that the entire programmatic awareness, prevention, and response are inclusive in sense, shall the survivor is men, women, or from LGBT community. So for us, it's very key, and this is a very important recommendation when we want to apply the policies around sexual exploitation and abuse, is to ensure in the reflection, in the application, and in the accountability that the system is accessible to all. So for women or for men or for any group, and at the same time joining also Marion from Oxfam in sense of the layer of reporting mechanism also to reflect on what is accessible by who, and when and how. Because for men, we need to ask the people concerned. For men, they might be comfortable in sending an anonymous email, but not maybe calling, or maybe coming to the forefront to speak to the person. From our organization as an accountability officer or someone under the monitoring and evaluation, we have these different layers that are written and explained because we take into account illiterate women in the camps at the same time, to give them the multiple options, either calling, we have like a summary flyer outside about our system. So either calling a helpline number 24/7, which like there's a person not within the organization power position that will respond, and indicating if they prefer to speak to a male or a female, because we need to provide both. There's the email as a medium, anonymous email, or at the same time a complaint box in the community, or coming and talking to someone at the management in the organization. And this will help a lot for men or women to come and speak up. And this is important. But just very briefly commenting on the question related to measures after completion of investigation. This is embedded in our HR induction, because everyone that reached the point of like being accepted, they know that there's the code of conduct, there is the PSEA, there is the child protection policy, anti-fraud, different things. But also it's part of the staff handbook that they are inducted about from the beginning, that violation of these, it means immediate break of contract. And we reserve the right to communicate to any future employer, even the Ministry of Labor, to put it in his or her file, that this kind of allegation happened. And because we apply at the same time the penal code, which is like the general civil law, that is beyond a law or a rule of the organization. It's a process that will follow the person residing on the territory, no matter where they are now. So from the beginning, we communicate this, that we reserve the right even to provide a reference check or a letter of employment. Depends on the degree of the violation for sure, but this is very key for us. Just very lastly, very briefly, also on the question on inclusion of everybody. It's one of the key aspects and concern in how to make not only those that come to structures involved in these. And this is why we created that, and we strongly advise organizations to do it, a very systemic structure of mobile team. Like we have a touring bus that goes actually to communities where the women are not enrolled and coming into structures. And the same complaint mechanism introduced in safe spaces or structures is also always communicated and advertised with these women, to tell them, like, if anything shall happen by any humanitarian aid worker or our team, like how is the medium? And we went creative in the modality of giving them numbers, the helpline numbers, in a way where they feel safe in safeguarding that. Because giving like a flyer sometimes is not okay with the woman, if she's illiterate or else, to keep it with her, to use it shall need it. So in some communities, they asked us to do a sewing of the number on a small dignity kit, like the pocket where you put the sanitary pad from the inside. And we did that. And then we distributed these while the phone number is inside, like not visible for men in the community. And if she leaves, she can take it with her without like looking at it as a piece of paper that let me search for the business card, emergency card. We need to go creative about it. Same for like small powder box, like behind the mirror, there's a phone number. We just simply, in a nutshell, encourage like really speaking to the people concerned, because they will tell us what they feel comfortable about us doing. How do you want the phone number? And then tailor it accordingly. In one community in Beka, they told us that they want this short video that give classes about cooking, because they can listen to it and to be broadcasted by WhatsApp. And then there's like a kind of, as we do the subtitles, down in the video, there's like information about like if you want to talk to somebody, have more information, and have the number over there. And this is how they feel comfortable to receive information, broadcast by WhatsApp, not SMS, and a very general video about cooking or classes of yoga or classes of self-defense, whatever, and embed information there, because this is where their husbands or head of communities will not really dig and search. And we simply produce that. Or even if technically we look at it like, okay, maybe we're not aligned with it, but we need to be aligned with the people want and feel safe about, and reshuffle accordingly. Yeah, sorry, it was long.
Thank you. I mean, in relation to the question over here about men who have sex with men, I mean, from my perspective, there's one very important way in which rights are kind of blind. The important thing is that a right is being violated. It's less to do with the identity, the group identity or whatever of the person. It's to do with the fact that a right is being violated, and it's identifying that is the critical issue. It's this idea of impartiality. The wonderful thing about the #MeToo movement is that we had these alleged structure of rights, but because of systemic structural problems, huge numbers of women, the interests of huge numbers of women were being violated. So what this movement is doing is saying, for this group of people, rights are routinely overshadowed. And the movement brings that, and there's absolutely no reason why any other group of individuals, any other individual whose rights are being violated, for whom the duties of organisations are not being properly fulfilled shouldn't have a claim. And I think we need to celebrate and focus on that, because that's critical. The question down here, the gentleman down here, there is a problem, isn't there? What do you do with information about people that hasn't got as far as due judicial process? What do you do with that data? I mean, the lovely thing about your organisation is you've already had a deal, which is if we get access to that information, we're going to disperse it, and somebody agrees to that arrangement. But it's a real challenge, and a nettle that has to be grasped. How do we deal with information that is in some respects remains anecdotal and unsupported? It's a huge challenge. I don't think we've got there yet, but it's something we really badly need to look at. And in relation to the question down here, I mentioned earlier, organisations have duties to their staff. You've got a clear rights holder and a clear duty bearer. In this context, it's much more confusing. And so there again, we need to look at clear and coherent procedure for dealing with what are effectively complaints. How do you deal with that in relation to people who are not employed by the organisation and therefore who you don't have direct responsibility for? Again, two really quite interesting challenges.
Yeah, thanks a lot. To the question regarding the LGBTI community, everything I said, and I apologize for not having mentioned it, applies to that as well. And I found what you said just very important. It's about the right and not about the rest. Then the question on how to share information. That is something I think everybody in this sector now struggles with, because everybody wants to know, but we are having very protective laws when it comes to the personal rights, when it comes to data rights. We have the Datenschutzgrundverordnung, sorry, I don't know that in English. And all that is there to protect the personal rights of somebody, and also our labor law is supportive of that. So it is not easy to get around it, and it is for a good reason. So we cannot say suddenly, okay, now we want to have openness and we want to talk about everything and everybody, whereas at the same time, we are actually lobbying for the safety and security of personal rights. So I think we have to find a balance here, and we need more to pull on that string.
Indeed. Thank you to all the panelists. If I may take the liberty, I would like to have a stab at some of the answers myself, or at least to share my own reflections. And in particular, on this issue of inclusion of men and boys, I have felt very personally upset, both at my own failing, but also at the tone of a lot of the dialogue we've had in the last year that has absolutely systematically failed to recognise that we are talking about anyone being capable of being the victim or survivor of abuse. And it's partly because I think as practitioners, we haven't always had visibility. So if you had asked me whether this was going to happen and I was going to have this kind of stage this time last year, or even, I don't know, 6 months ago, I probably would have said no, never in a month of Sundays. But actually, if you ask the people who've been doing this work for the last 16 years since the PSEA Secretary General's Bulletin, most of us have been having this fight internally to try and improve the nuance of the debate we're having internally, where you can simultaneously recognise that anybody can survive violence and be a victim or survivor of it. Anybody could perpetrate it, but actually still apply a feminist or any other type of intersectional perspective, which recognises that in most cases it will affect these communities or these communities or these communities. And I think, as coming from a strong feminist movement myself in the context of Oxfam, where I was moving from a women-only space into a space where my stakeholders could literally have been anybody, it was quite a personally challenging time for me philosophically. But it was very clear to us, particularly within Oxfam, that right from the beginning, every single piece of communication you gave to anybody you spoke to about this issue, and I take my responsibility very seriously. In fact, I think it's a privilege to have the kind of job that I do. you have got to convey that you understand that anybody can experience these things, because everybody is your stakeholder. And because there haven't been enough people in roles like this who can be identified to be independent enough from the rest of the management team, from the HR processes, from the complexity of dealing with the balance of personal and labour rights versus what's right and what's happened. You can't always convey that. And so what we tended to do, I think your question was also practically what can you do about it? And actually, as I mentioned, one of the most exciting and privileged things that I got to do in my role and continue to is to talk to communities. And that's not just the communities we work with. I don't do that anywhere near enough, but just our own. And creating a situation where you try to create a safe space to talk about issues that most of our staff in most of the countries in the world will never have been able to speak about together. You are starting that process. There, in my experience, no matter which corner of the world you are having this conversation, there are always people within the community, within our own environments, who are willing to stand up and put their head above the parapet. And actually what we've failed to do is to support those people to do that. And as an organisation, to say to them, yeah, we believe in that too. You know, we're not going to accept that homosexuality will be discriminated against. We're not going to accept racism. We're not going to accept sexism. We're not going to accept this, this, and this. Because it's integral to what we do. And we are actually going to take the chance as an organisation to invest in having a conversation with you about why that is. Meanwhile, recognising, from the example you yourself gave, that there are, of course, many dangers associated in all parts of the world when you're talking about particularly men who have sex with men, or even male survival of violence. So I think the fact that we haven't recognised that this happens isn't just unique to this sector. I think it's unique and it's far-ranging. It's a debate that we felt we had very little credibility to contribute to in many ways as the women's sector in the UK, but tried wherever we could to support the male community to create and organise themselves. And what I really hope is coming as a second wave is the Me Too movement, where more male survivors feel comfortable to. I mean, there have been examples of male survivors coming out. And I would like to say that actually we met with and attracted complaints from quite a few male survivors in Oxfam. And I think that's when my team and I were deeply humbled and realised, oh, something about this is working. You know, we didn't expect that for quite some time once we'd begun this journey. So by no means can any of us in this room think we've gone anywhere near to achieving what you're talking about. But it's not as difficult from my experience to introduce those conversations, particularly if we start them from within. That's my 2 pennies worth. In relation to the particularly to the contract question, which I love that you asked, Tom. I would absolutely love for one thing to be understood about this particular issue. Speaking as a practitioner who's worked across 71 countries initially, an organisation has every right to complete an investigation whether the perpetrator or accused person decides to participate in it or not. Okay, so there is absolutely no reason in the vast majority of cases that we see and we receive and we try that we can't complete that process. What due process and the means to uphold your rights as an employee and as someone who is always entitled to a fair process, you should be offering the accused 2 or 3 opportunities to participate and explain very clearly in the right written language, we are going to make a decision whether you participate or not. And once we've made it, we will communicate to you what that decision is, and we will tell you what we are likely to say in any future references we receive for you. And actually, I think that covers most of the cases that I've ever sort of encountered that might fall into that camp that you're referring to. The other side of it shows the real value, I think, of having an independent team like mine, because we were able to manage intelligence. So we were able to have conversations which ultimately led to the organisation thinking, are we willing to take a risk here? The risk will be litigation from the person who is accused, or it might be the cost of a case by the person who accused. Once you've started a process, you can finish it. And again, this is another call for getting people who know what they're talking about, who can balance the 5 or 6 different areas of law that you need to for an organisation of the size of Oxfam, or even an organisation smaller than the ones that you're running here, Ghida. So I think we need to remove some of this fear and mythology around. I think it's a fantastic question, and it's the question, actually, isn't it, for a lot of people. You can tell people in references what you've done. In the vast majority of environments, if what you've done hasn't been an investigation, then you've still done something, right? And it opens a conversation. And the final point, I think, moving on, is to make the point that I think us not knowing how to do complaints mechanisms that work for communities is symptomatic of a much bigger problem. For me, the fact that we are so structurally powerful over those communities and that we systematically fail to engage them in the way we design ourselves and our programs is the reason why we fail to reach them in the first place. So actually, the kinds of things that we should be doing and the UN Secretary General Bulletin directed us to do for the last 16 years is to explain to every member of our community, this is the behavior you should expect from our staff. If these kinds of things happen, these are the multiple different ways you can engage with us as a bare minimum. But actually, I think it's that we go further. We could go further and actually say, how many of us have listened and done a proper needs analysis, or have truly understood how a program will be more successful in a particular community. So I think once you start looking at that structural problem, we might get better at reaching more people at that level. Were there other points there? We've got
very, very small additional commentary on the data protection protocol, because it requires like big reflection. I think we don't have all the time now to do it, but it's not only about the person who committed the harm within the organization toward an employee, but there is also the data related to the employee who disclosed that. Because when we think about data protection protocol, it's called protection, and it needs to preserve dignity no matter what the behavior is, in a sense that is thinking not only what to do with the result of investigation to communicate or not, but we're living in context where sometimes we need to think of this, there's a fire, there's a war, and we need to evacuate. Like in Lebanon, we don't think about data protection protocol only from the perspective of communicating or not, keeping or destroying the data. Sometimes we operate in areas where we have to move, like in our safe shelters, for instance, where we have women in life-threatening situation. There's the entire data under the GBV IMS or else, what to do in case we need to do evacuation. Because these data, sometimes about people talking about an abuse they have been struggling with, it might become more risky and harmful for them if these information falls in wrong hands. And especially, just going back to the colleague, but when we talk about male survivors, I'm sorry, this is a misconception if we believe only that male will harass male. We have situations where we have female in position of power.
Absolutely.
Not by necessity we're talking about rape, but we're talking about sexually harassing male staff and while she's in position of power. And this, we witnessed that and we hear about it, and we can have it also from female humanitarian worker toward male young adult in communities we're serving. So abuse can happen from anybody toward anybody. Most vulnerable are women, or most affected can be women because of vulnerability of other aspects in the economic structures and many other things. But it can happen, and we're not talking about only male having sex with male. This will provoke me a lot. We're talking about also it can be anybody harassing anybody for multiple reasons. And that's why we have the responsibility in making sure how we engage the people that work with us, for us, and for the people we're serving, okay? Especially for the safeguarding thing.
Very good point. Nora, do we have time quickly for a question? Yeah, we've got a question here. I'm sorry, we can't see very well. Do you want me to? Oh, yeah. Oh, sorry. We can have two very, very, very quick questions. Sorry about this. Yeah.
So, I'm Abdulaziz from Noha Bochum. I have a question for Marion Lisa. I am a keen visitor of your website, Oxfam, and read about your projects and so on. I have read that you are working with more than 3,000 partner organizations around the world. My question is, how do you monitor and control the gender-based violence within your partner organization? What parameter do you set for your partner organization? And what do you do if your partner organization don't follow your rules, or they don't, for example, give they don't take action on for example, gender-based violence when it is occurred in their organizations?
Shall we quickly take the second one? And then, yeah, thank you, Marion. We have a second one at the back. Hey.
My name is Daniel from Friedensau University. I just wanted to find out, we are talking about response. I agree with the mechanisms that are involved with responding to these kind of issues. But for me, what is most important is prevention. This should not even happen in the first place. So how can we put in concrete measures? I know at the global level, there are rights that are failing us. There are institutions that have been put in place that are not working. But for humanitarian workers like us, how can we put in structures, even within our small systems that we run, to prevent it from happening? So for example, we shouldn't even have a case in any organizations for us as humanitarian workers where we have issues of sexual exploitation. So how can we practically, for me as maybe a leader of an organization, how can I take that back to be able to ensure that I have a staff that understands the dynamics of these things and do not make these things happen? Because response is okay, but let's also spend some money to prevent it even from happening in the first place. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Marion, I think you can respond.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks a lot. That was a brilliant question, because that is definitely true that we are dealing with more than 3,000 partner organizations, and we try to ensure that those partner organizations are living up to our expectations. How are we doing that? We are having contracts with the partner organizations, and part of the contract is a certain standard, which is including a behavioral standard. And if there is anything happening which comes to our attention, we will definitely take care of it in the way we should. I mean, protecting the individuals, talking to the individuals, and looking, I mean, seriously into the matter. But of course, Oxfam is not able to go into all the details any partner organization is doing at any moment. So there are also limits by the nature of the relationship between the partner organization and Oxfam. But as I said, we try our level best to have trained managers who would be aware of signs of any kind of misconduct, especially sexual misconduct, and immediately act on it according to the protocols which we have in place. And then just to the second, sorry, I can't see you. I totally agree that prevention is key, and also when it comes to the partner organizations, because of course we are screening partner organizations, we are looking into criteria, whom to work with and how to collaborate and all that. And when we are talking about localization of humanitarian responses, that will be definitely an issue we have to address, and prevention definitely is key.
And just very quickly, when it comes to extremely prevention, it never happening, when it comes to extremely virtuous behaviour, perhaps because I've lived with myself for too long, I'm a bit pessimistic when it comes to human beings. I believe that people need good institutions. When I look across the Atlantic, when I look what's going on in America, when I see a democratic institution struggling to contain profoundly anti-democratic forces, I'm tempted to say, look at your institutions, because In order for people to behave virtuously, they need virtuous institutions behind them. We need, to a certain extent, sadly, as human beings, to be protected from ourselves, and our institutions need to do that.
Yeah, I don't think anyone could put any better than that. My final point, having worked a lot on this prevention issue, is that I would just urge people, whilst prevention should always be our ultimate aim, to recognise that to do proper prevention work and to understand the size and the scale and the nature of the problem, you must always be doing good response work. There should be 4 pillars of work that interchange with each other all the time in order to achieve a truly preventative piece of work. We don't know what works to prevent this properly yet. I would guess it includes the tone that's set from the top. I would guess it means improving drastically the kind of HR and recruitment procedures that we use, along with proper actions for people not only who commit abuse, but for people who condone and allow it to happen on the sidelines. Okay, we've clearly got to vacate the room unless you're here for the next talk, but please join me in giving a huge thanks to all the panelists today.